All right, Dr. Bowman, it's very nice to have you here today. As you know, we would like to explore your experiences and thinking about the PRBA over these last 30 plus years. Certain estimates say 34, 35, 36. There's a little bit of a standard error there, if you will. But we'd like to begin with your early experiences at the University of Michigan and what led you to the University of Michigan before we talk a little bit about how you eventually got connected to the National Survey of Black Americans.
Okay, my early experience at the University of Michigan started in June of 1970, and I came here as a graduate student, originally on a master's program, and I then switched over to a doctoral program after I completed my master's degree in 1971. What brought me to University of Michigan was graduate studies.
Okay. And so when you first got to the University of Michigan for graduate studies, what program were you in?
The original program I was in was a master's program in basically counseling psychology.
Okay. And so how did
in
you...
higher education.
Okay, counseling psychology in higher education. Okay. And so how did you end up in the Department of Psychology?
I finished a master's degree and decided to complete the PhD in social psychology.
Okay. And so at what point did you first learn about the National Survey of Black Americans?
I learned about it when the concept was first being discussed. At that time, I just finished up my PhD and was actually working at ISR. Belinda Tucker and I were both doctoral students here and both finished up in the mid-70s. And James Jackson was assistant professor here. And Jerry Gurin I had worked with even prior to entering the PhD program in social psychology because he was a professor in higher ed. So I had worked with Jerry actually and Pat since 1970.
Okay.
And James came into the university around 70. I think one year I maybe 71, 72. James came in. So that was much prior to the concept of NSBA, but just the group of individuals who ended up working together in the mid to late 70s on what became the National Survey of Black Americans.
Okay. And so preceding the National Survey of Black Americans, what kind of work were you doing in terms of your substantive research area?
I was doing work pretty much convergent with the National Survey of Black Americans. I was doing, in 1977, I finished up my PhD here, and I started originally with a research scientist position in the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research. Myself and Belinda Tucker were both involved in research programs in the Survey Research Center. James was assistant professor and also research faculty member in the Research Center for Group Dynamics. Belinda and I were both research scientists in Survey Research Center. Belinda was working in a research program with Joe Veroff and Libby Duvon. We're doing large national studies of kind of gender and family issues. And the first year, 77, 78, that I was here as a research scientist, I worked primarily with several research programs in the Survey Research Center under the kind of mentorship of Stephen Withy, who was the director of the Survey Research Center at the time.
Okay.
And that was the year, actually kind of prior to the project being funded.
Okay, so as you recall the early conversations around what would eventually develop to become the NSBA, what do you remember about those conversations? How did they develop?
Well, it was a bunch of, the center of those conversations was James Jackson, who at that time was on faculty in the Department of Psychology and Social Psychology, and had worked very closely with Belinda and myself, along with I had also worked with Jerry Gurin prior to coming to the social psychology program. I worked with him as part of the master's program, so I'd worked with Jerry a long time. So the first kind of conceptualization of the proposal, that led to the funding for that first project really centered around James. And since Belinda was actually already working, because she started working as a research scientist here in the Server Research Center probably 1 to 2 years prior to me. And so it was really James, Belinda, and a group of graduate students, all of whom we were all graduate students together. The ones who I recall worked most closely, because I think it was one of those years I left, and it was one of those years I left because I was here in full-time employment, because unlike some of my colleagues, I had young children to feed. But the primary people who worked with James on that first proposal, actually Wayne McCullough did some work, on, I know, the identity section. Esther Jenkins was also a graduate student who worked very closely with James and Belinda on certain parts of that proposal. We were all graduate students here together, so I was involved more indirectly at that stage, largely because I think that was one of those transitional years for me. The year that they did most of the central work on the proposal itself, but James was certainly the organizer, and the brain thrust around this concept. And of course, Jerry was always the sage mentor, for the group, because he had done, in many ways, the study was conceptualized as a scaffold on the 1957 national survey that Jerry Gurin directed, Americans View Your Mental Health, which was kind of a prototype. In fact, if I recall, that was the first national survey of the national population with explicit focus on mental health. So that was in some ways the kind of foundation for this type of work within ISR. James had spearheaded the idea of doing the national survey of Black Americans scaffold on Chicano study that was already in the field. So there was a national survey of the Mexican origin population that had already been funded by NIMH, and Jerry Gurin was also the program director who kind of provided leadership for that study. Carlos Arce, who had graduated actually in higher ed, who got a PhD working with Jerry in higher ed, was the principal investigator for the national Chicano study, we would call it, and it was essentially a national probability sample of the Mexican origin population in the United States. And in some way, they were they had already gotten funded, and in some ways, the National Survey of Black Americans scaffold on that study. And Jerry kind of was the staff member, the kind of senior, if you will, staff member at ISR that kind of supported both Carlos, who was the PI for the Chicano study, and James Jackson, who was the brain thrust behind the Black study, we used to call it. In fact, that's what it was called probably for the first, certainly all of the whole period of time when people were doing the proposal development. It was the Chicano study and the Black study.
Okay, all right. And so, just for clarification, you mentioned that at least one point during this very early period, you took on full employment to take care of the babies. And
That was during graduate student.
Oh, so that was so during this part of the time.
That was long before.
Long before.
The study. At the time the National Survey of Black Americans occurred, I had just finished up my PhD.
Got it. And you're a research scientist.
Yeah, both Belinda and I were both working on other research programs at ISR.
Okay.
And she involved primarily with, again, Joe Veroff and Libby Duvon, and they had a program of research, and we're doing a big national study, family study, gender and family roles. And Belinda was a primary researcher on that project. But she was also, at the same time, working with James, conceptualizing the proposal for that ultimately led to the NIMH funding of the first of what became the National Survey of Black Americans. I was working on primarily that first year, 77, 78. I was working primarily with Stephen Withy on several projects in the Survey Research Center, and Steve was kind of the mentor that I worked with during that first year. At that time, he was the director of the Survey Research Center.
Okay.
And James, so there was no funding for a black study. Both Belinda and I were kind of primary researchers here. James was primarily assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, but also was a faculty associate in the Research Center for Group Dynamics. And that was the kind of precursor. But they had done some conceptual work on the proposal during the time I was probably finishing up my dissertation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So as things kind of creep forward, what becomes the motivating rationale for really doing the national survey? In other words, why is this important at this day and time?
I mean, in some ways, you had the same kind of argument that led to America's View Your Mental Health in the 57, that they had no probability sample of the national population to look at issues that affect the mental health and well-being of the American population. So by extension, with the diversification of the nation, the largest two ethnic groups, the Latino population, Mexican origin population being the largest sub-ethnic group of the growing Latino population, and then of course the African Americans being at that time the largest racial ethnic group in the country. By extension, then the notion would be that existing national studies, including American View of Mental Health and all the rest of the national probability samples that were available at ISR at the time, had very small samples of African Americans, even smaller samples of the Latino population, and certainly not enough to do any analysis that would be generalizable with any accuracy to the national population. That was the biggest argument, and the notion was it was extremely important to understand those factors that impede and promote the mental health of these very significant segments of American population, the Latino population or the Mexican origin population that was actually funded, and then the African American population. So, in some ways, that was the rationale behind America's View Your Mental Health in terms of the general national population, the Chicano study or the Mexican origin sample that preceded the National Survey of Black Americans, and by extension, what became the National Survey of Black Americans.
Okay. And so as the survey, as I understand it, there was a interest by Jerry Gurin, who proposed to, I guess, what would be the kind of executive board of the ISR at that time, that there might be a NSBA, if you will, a black study done. And that he knew a talented young assistant professor by the name of James Jackson in psychology, who had the motivation and interest to do such a study, and had preliminary conversations with James on this, at which time James sort of corralled interested graduate students and they got working on, in broad strokes, they got working on a proposal. What I understand is that the early thing was kind of put together with you, Belinda Tucker, and James and Jerry, the proposal.
Actually, it was less me.
Okay.
The original proposal was really developed, leaders for the black study, scaffold on the Chicano study. And there had already been a proposal funded, and Jerry brokered that.
Okay.
And you're correct. And in that one, Carlos Arce became the person who became the PI on it. He certainly brokered, as you suggested, the endorsement or commitment or investment by the Institute for Social Research in the black study. Because that's a big institutional commitment. And in some ways, and Jerry, but James became the, if you will, the whole kind of center of gravity behind pulling it off. In some ways, it was not so much discovering James. James was already here.
Right.
Sure. James was here. He was he was the only, certainly the primary African American researcher at ISR. You had a couple other African American faculty members in the Department of Psychology, but none with the kind of central location that James had carved out, if you will, within ISR. So it wasn't so much that James was discovered for this study. James had been here since 71, 72. So James had been here as a faculty member and as a research faculty, as a faculty member in the Department of Psychology, but also as a research faculty member in the Research Center for Group Dynamics at ISR for 5 years. Well, for 4 or 5 years. So it wasn't discovering James. James was pretty much here, had really carved out a leadership role, especially among us graduate students, because in some ways we were all graduate students here together in the early 70s. There was no black faculty here in 1970. A couple started in the early 70s. You had Ewart Thomas and Frank Yates, and then James came in. But James was the only one affiliated with ISR, and the only one who ended up working with us doctoral students who were very interested in survey research, including Belinda and myself, but also including people like Wayne McCullough and Esther Jenkins, both of whom contributed significantly to that first proposal under James' leadership. But it was certainly Belinda as the primary, and by that time Belinda had finished, because Belinda and I, finished kind of in the mid 70s. So Belinda had finished. So she collaborated with James on that proposal, not as a graduate student, but as a new research faculty in the Survey Research Center. And it was a group of graduate students working with James and Belinda.
Okay. And
I was not among the ones who worked most closely on that first proposal. I knew it was being done, and talked to them about every section, but while I was on my way to work.
Sure. So the proposal goes in, and to make a long story short, it ends up being funded.
Right.
And
by that time, I was already working here, and Belinda was already working here.
Right.
Well, Belinda had been working here, but I was working here as a research scientist in the Survey Research Center.
Right. And so the proposal
actually during the time it was under review, to be frank. So that first year it was really under review.
Okay. So then the proposal comes back.
Got funded.
And now you guys have to.
Well, I decided to work with so in some ways it was my decision to work as a primary researcher on that project at that time. Belinda and James had already made the commitment because they were pretty much the architects of the proposal itself. You see my point? So by the time it got funded, I decided, to work on that project as my primary commitment here at ISR. So in some way, so James, Belinda, and I began to work together at the time it was funded.
Got it.
But really for 2 years prior, James and Belinda had been working very closely together on the conceptualization and the proposal development.
Okay. All right. That's clear. That provides clarity. So then, after, so now it's funded. You're on the project, and along with James and Belinda
And Jerry,
and Jerry, of
who's
course.
the godfather. In some way, Jerry brokered it. And
Yeah.
again, I repeat, Jerry had been the principal investigator of the prototype
Right.
national survey of which this scaffold on. He had
Right.
also been the co-PI on the Chicano study that preceded it.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, the black study was done in that context. And much of the early work we did was closely allied with the work being done on Chicano study. We
Right.
worked very closely with them. Instrument development, the field work, the demographics and the distribution of the black population and the Latino population, or the Mexican origin population, which is what that Chicano study focused on, is different. So we had different logistical and strategic challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, there was a lot of convergence.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as both were the first national surveys of these large racial ethnic populations in the U.S. And both then scaffold on the original 1957 Americans View Your Mental Health, but had to tailor it in the Chicano study to the special circumstances of the Mexican origin population. And we in turn had to tailor it to the special circumstances of the African American population.
So, along those lines of tailoring things to address or to question, to probe specific issues in the African American population, when you guys sit down, the proposal's been funded, you guys are now sitting down and starting to think about what kinds of questions are going to be asked, how are they going to be asked, what are some of the unique things that you guys discussed and addressed during that period?
Yeah, well, there's probably two things noteworthy. One, the whole framing of the proposal was one that focused on methodology, innovation, and methodological innovation, largely because there were no existing culturally sensitive instruments, no methodological strategies to collect national probability data with accuracy that really represented the entirety of the African American population. So there was a bunch of methodological innovations built into the first proposal. In some ways, that was the focus, methodological conceptual innovation. So in some ways, the whole thing was set out to break new ground, by design. It was the way in which James and Belinda and Jerry, in consultation with Jerry and with support of the graduate students who worked on it, they framed it that way. Now I got involved in implementing that,
Okay.
along with Belinda. And James being the kind of PI, but in some ways Belinda and I were the kind of primary researchers with a lot of graduate students.
Mm-hmm.
Because at that time, it's again when it was funded, both Belinda and I were already primary researchers here at ISR, but had a bunch of graduate students, including who are still graduate students, including Wayne McCullough. Esther Jenkins and a whole set of social psychological students. Then we picked up a bunch of other graduate students during the development of the project itself. The part of what was extremely innovative about the design was to set up extensive measurement development, instrument development. So unlike any of the other studies, I can't think of any that's ever been done at ISR, where we had a whole year and to the second year just to develop the instruments and to pre-test it, before we even thought about having to collect data.
Mm-hmm.
So that with that, and the goal there was to develop unique, responsive, culturally relevant measures, to both take baseline indicators from existing studies when they were appropriate, but to also test them to make sure that they were reliable and valid for the black population. And then in to look also through the use of focus groups and a whole host of other more qualitative approaches, what other constructs were critical to consider if you really wanted to look in a meaningful way at mental health among the African American population. So, for example, what came out of a lot of the qualitative work up front is you had to look at religion in ways that no other national study ever had. If you didn't, you wouldn't tap into what kind of factors bore significantly on the mental health of the African American population. That's just one example. You had to look much more in depth at issues of employment. You had to look much more in depth at issues of non-traditional resource utilization. Know that we had no measures on any of that, but our qualitative work during the first year indicated that if we really wanted to study the mental health of the African American population in meaningful ways, we had to develop new measures to tap into those kind of constructs. So we had to go into a whole a process of developing new indicators to tap into those areas that had not been focused on in prior national studies. But our work during the first 2 years indicated that we needed to do that in order to focus, to look at the mental health of African Americans in meaningful ways. Identity and consciousness was another area. So we had to do lots of focus groups. We had to develop measures and do back translation, back translation, which is a technique often used in cross-cultural research. So we did that for 2 years to generate an instrument, which is why, that instrument, tapped into domains and had indicators on it sufficient for collecting data from a national probability sample that you wouldn't find in any other survey that had been done before then. And one of the mechanisms that and I had responsibility for doing for kind of leading a lot of that work on the instrument development. We had a national advisory committee, of experts in these areas who had done innovative work on smaller populations usually, community-based surveys, who could kind of bring that expertise and allow us to at least scaffold on what they had done, not in national surveys, but in more focused studies of the African American population. People like Sherman James were on that was on that advisory committee and helped us develop measures that tapped into constructs that are much more meaningful in the social epidemiology or those social factors and determinants of mental health for African American populations. He was, happened to be, one of the top scholars in the country. He was at this very esteemed University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So he, for example, was one of the people on the advisory committee. Also had people like Carl Bell, who directed the Community Mental Health Council in Chicago. Had done a lot of community-based work, not systematic survey data, but brought a lot of depth of understanding of the black population and mental health in urban contexts. So those are just two, but we had A.J. Franklin, who was from New York City and on the mental health board for the state of New York. Hank Tomes, who the director of state health departments, in several states in the country. So we had very top people from all around the country who came in and worked with us to lay out these domains of focus, and also to develop reliable and valid measures to tap into those constructs in order to look at the mental health of African Americans in a more comprehensive way than it ever had been. And again, that was framed into the original proposal, but frame it and implement it, as they say, was quite a feat, quite a challenge, and it cost a lot of money, to do this and do a pre-testing, all over the country. We went and did pre-test data in rural areas and urban areas, all over the country. It cost a lot of money, and the study ended up costing a lot more than what we had funding for, which, you have to also give James Jackson a lot of credit, for working with us and kind of keeping us getting the work done and on track. when the money was spent real quick. And then we had to figure out how to continue to make progress on the data collection, the instrument design, the sampling, the data collection, but also worry about how to get some more money in to actually get the study out of the field.
Right. So there's a considerable amount of energy spent on making sure that the questions, that the measurement was uniquely suited to the African American population. There was also some concern regarding the sampling frame and the uniqueness of that frame. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, it's not so much the frame. It's the whole question of how do you do a national probability sample of the African American population and represent Black people as they are distributed in the general population. And again, we had analogs for the general population, because that's what the Survey Research Center is world class in. We also had analogs, although they ran into their own difficulty, of the Latino population, the Mexican origin population, who had gone to the field about the year before we did. But the African American population has a unique distribution, and your other national studies of the African American population never had developed accurate probability sample to represent African American people in low density areas. That is, African American people in places where African American people are a very small portion. So a lot of the innovation, for example, came, if we really want an accurate sample of the African American population, one that represents African American people as they're distributed in the population, not as is convenient to collect data from them in a cost-effective way. So a lot of the innovation went into really trying to have a very, not a quota sample, but a national probability sample, first of all, and then secondly, a national probability sample of the African American population as it's distributed in the general population. The things that have become, landmarks in some ways are the things like the WASP sampling procedure, which was developed specifically to represent equal to their distribution in the population, African Americans in low density areas, in low density neighborhoods. That technique, for example, was developed in order to make sure that our sample was a lot more accurate representation of the general population than any other sample that ever been done. So certainly there was those methodological innovations in sampling as well, and I think that probably is the most noteworthy one.
Okay. So now you've got the questions, and you develop not you specifically, but the group develops a sampling frame uniquely tailored to find a representative sample of African Americans in the U.S. And it's time to go out and collect data. So tell us a little bit about how that developed and occurred.
Also daunting, because part of the methodological innovation was that if you look at methodological studies on the African population in particular, you get more accurate data if you have rates match interview respondents. What we had existing in the array of expertise in the field office was a bunch of highly trained white interviewers, distributed all over the country, not necessarily where Black people were concentrated. So we had two kind of mismatches, if you will. One, we had a interviewing staff available that mismatched, at least racially, the sample that we want to collect data from. Had we done that, then we would have had less accurate data. We know that from all the methodological studies. Secondly, we really wouldn't have had enough interviewers in certain places, especially in urban areas, where Black people are concentrated more than whites. And also there's lots of challenges in collecting data, and especially in those rather high risk, if you will, kind of urban areas. So we faced the data collection challenge of going with the general field staff and having lower quality data as a function of mismatch between the race of the interviewer and respondent, and also having interviewers who could not navigate those terrains in ways that would have led to response rates that we were successful in getting. So because of those two considerations, we decided that we would train our own interview staff, which is something that's, when I even repeat it now, one would say it's almost impossible, to do a national sample and train your own interview staff all over the nation in places that represents the entire black population, from all the rural areas to the most urban, to distribute it, throughout the country. But we, being young and inspired by James Jackson, that we can do this, we decided that we would do it because it was the method and approach to data collection that would yield higher quality data, and we were committed to doing a high quality study. So that made for a profound set of innovations just in both interview selection, training, and management of field staff, because we had to create our own.
Right, which is also very costly.
Costly, both in terms of money, time, and human resource.
Absolutely.
All three.
Yeah. So, so you guys find out a way to, or you guys create and train your own interview staff nationally.
Right. And managed it.
And manage it.
Because you had to do all.
Yeah.
You had to find them, you had to train them, you had to manage them in location.
Right.
In order to get a high response rate.
Right. And so, so the study essentially goes out into the field, and a bunch of interviewers are asking questions of a bunch of respondents, and
not a bunch of interviewers. I'll say this: the other benefit or strategic thing here is that you also not only get higher quality data from methodological studies by having race matching of interviewing respondents, but also having indigenous interviewers, which means that not only the skin tone matches, but they know the terrain that they're operating in. Mm-hmm. Indigenous. So we had to train people in those locations that they were familiar with, mm-hmm. and manage them in those locations. I say that because we have a lot of methodological work that know that if you really want to get high quality data and you really want to get high response rates, then you need to do both of those things. So our interview staff that we selected, trained, and managed, had both characteristics. They were both race matched, but also somewhat indigenous for the most part to those local areas where they collected data.
Okay. And so, did you do any of the interviews by any chance? Did you go out in the field and do any interviews? Or?
Had to train everybody.
Okay.
So basically, by that time, Belinda had left and went to UCLA. By the time we got to, so much of that was done by myself. Shirley Hatchett had joined the primary research staff. Fortunately, too, because Shirley had worked in the field office, at ISR. She had done a lot of work with Howard Schuman on a lot of the black racial attitude studies in Detroit and urban areas, and she had also worked in the field office, at the Survey Research Center. So, she had a lot of experience interviewing, training interviewers, operating data collection, kind of nuts and bolts. So myself and Shirley, and then the other person that was really core part of the full-time research staff, because we had lots of graduate students, but the full-time research staff there, in addition to James, was myself, Shirley Hatchett, and then Letha Tradiha. Letha also became extremely critical in the data collection stage because she joined the staff as a research associate. And Letha, too, like Shirley, had, unlike Belinda and myself, who were mostly, we were doctoral students, we got a PhD, we started up as primary researchers. Shirley and Letha had both pre-doc and worked as in ISR on several research projects in the field office, or as research associates, who actually do a lot of the hands-on work. So Letha, for example, had worked at ISR since the late 60s. So she had been around a long time on several projects as a research associate who takes on a lot of responsibility for data collection and a whole host of other things. So she joined the staff and also was extremely resourceful, if you will, in designing, the whole strategy for the field operation, as well as the training of the interviewers to operate, the local kind of field operations. So that was the kind of a primary full-time staff, myself, Shirley Hatchett, and Letha. And then we had a bunch of graduate students who came and worked very, very closely with us to design and implement both the training as well as the maintenance of the field operation.
Okay. All right. So, it takes a lot of work to manage, in particular, train, etc. Get the field operation up and running. The study is in the field for about a year. No, 79, 80, right?
A couple of years.
Okay, so it comes out of the field, and people.
To get it out of the field, we had to do a 3-generation study.
That's right. So
to
that's
pay
right.
for it.
So we've talked about this a little bit before. So the study's in the field. It's running over budget, and at some point it becomes clear that more money is needed.
It will become clear real soon.
Right. And so what strategy was developed to support getting the study out of the field?
Again, James, as the PI on the study, in some ways we were doing a lot of the implementation stuff. James was really trying to take the lead in making sure we had money to get it done. And part of the strategic effort there was to get additional projects funded to get the cross-section out of the field. The training grant, the 3-gen study, and then the youth study. We're all instrumental in getting the cross-section study out of the field.
So tell us, in order, a little bit about each one of those studies and your role in those studies.
I worked very closely. Initially, with the framing of everything, worked very closely with Belinda, James, and Jerry. And then Belinda left and went to UCLA, and Shirley Hatchett joined the staff primarily. And most of those, the 3-gen study, I think Belinda did work with us on that one, right, and kind of in transition. And then I worked primarily as the director of the NIMH postdoc training program, which kind of provided some infrastructure support, staff, kind of support, because we had to keep the infrastructure in place. And then so in some ways it was a sequence. The 3-gen study was instrumental in getting the cross section out of the field. Then the youth study was instrumental in getting the 3-gen study out of the field.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then there was a bunch of, James also had to hustle a bunch of money from foundations. Got a bunch of money from foundations, not sufficient, to not as significant as some of the federal funding, but it was not an easy feat, to keep funding necessary to keep the staff in place to get that cross-section sample, and then to broker the 3-gen. Then you had to get the 3-gen thing out of the field. So in some way they were all interconnected in operational terms. And the graduate students, so I mentioned, it was myself, Belinda, and James and Jerry initially, and then when Belinda left, Shirley Hatchett and Letha. Letha actually joined before, relatively early, but Shirley kind of joined as Belinda left. And then there were a lot of the graduate students who were almost about to finish, played very significant roles. Especially Wayne worked very, very closely, especially early on. But you had Linda Chatters, Susan Mosley, worked extremely especially it's extremely demanding. A lot of it is training. So that the training of interviewers and maintaining the interviewers was extremely time intensive and labor intensive. And Robert Taylor worked very closely in some of the sampling stuff with Shirley, and then also the early stage instrument development transitional stuff. But we had a group of graduate students, some of whom Cleo worked. And even Ruby Bill also, who was here at the time, all of them, worked as graduate students who, played significant roles, and who, really played roles far beyond what most graduate students do, because we had to really ask them to do stuff commensurate with what primary researchers would do, but we couldn't ask them to do too much because they'd get their dissertations done, because at the time, it probably affected the younger graduate students less because they were at an earlier stage in their doctoral program and could use the data for their dissertations. So in some ways the investment was reasonable for them. Mm-hmm. But some of the advanced graduate students, who couldn't use the data necessarily, but I think it worked out quite well because a lot of most of those doctoral students did use the data for their dissertations. So in some ways, investment and return, worked out for them. But they certainly invested a lot.
Certainly. So, so it seems like at this point in time, in the early 80s, there are several studies that are fielded that are related to the original cross-sectional NSBA.
Scaffold on. All scaffold on. So in some ways, the original cross-section was the foundation for all the rest of them.
Got it. So.
But we didn't have enough money to get the original cross-section out of the field. So in some ways, it's interconnected in both ways.
Right. So. Is there a program yet? Is there a program for research on Black Americans at this point with these multiple studies? Or is it still kind of operating under the auspices of the, so to speak, Black study? Or
Yeah, it's the Black study. So you look at the archival stuff a little closer, and those dates can be ferreted out. But, certainly for the first couple of years, it was a National Survey of Black Americans. That was the brand. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, let me see. What year? So we got funding for the postdoc program. That was really a training program built on what? The National Survey of Black Americans. Mm-hmm. Not on PRBA, but it became part of what the rubric of PRBA had to be. Had to become a rubric mm-hmm. to include more than just the national survey, because we also had training activities. You see the point I'm making?
Right. Yep.
That's not a survey.
Right. Right.
That's a training program in NIMH 5-year postdoc training program.
Okay.
So in some ways it was just a training program attached to what?
The National Survey of Black Americans.
Right. And then likewise, the branding of the 3-gen study initially was just a 3-generational study scaffolding on
National Survey of Black
Right.
Americans. Okay.
And then, then finally James ended up, kind of leading a discussion about how to develop a rubric that would incorporate the NSBA and all the tentacles. Because by that time, that's what had occurred. You had the NSBA, National Survey of Black Americans, but you had all these tentacles attached to it, all of which scaffold on it. I remember some of the discussions about what to call it.
Yeah, so share some of those discussions.
It wasn't a lot elaborate. I mean, in some ways, I remember one really well. James came up, said, "I think I got a name, PRBA." That. So ultimately, that's what led to the Program of Research on Black Americans. The search for a rubric that would incorporate not only NSBA, but all the tentacles that developed from it. And then, the recognition that there needed to be a program of research by this time, within the tradition of ISR, and the Survey Research Center, and the Research Center for Group Dynamics, and all the rest of the centers within ISR, they all organized around programs. So therefore, there was enough sustainable funding, right? You got funding for NSBA to get it out of the field. You had these other projects funded, and by this time, a lot of investment on the part of ISR, right? You also had become effective in soliciting multiple external funds. So, it made sense within the tradition of ISR to develop a what?
Program.
Right. Question is what to call it. And again, a bunch of discussions about that, with brainstorming. But I do remember one discussion very well, where, Action Jackson, Dr. Jackson, James, in his traditional, in his kind of typical way, so my recall is that the idea came from James. Because I remember that discussion, and we were having this discussion about what to call it and what have you. And I remember James saying, I got a name, and he said the Program of Research on Black Americans, and that's ultimately what stuck.
I hear there was some debate in the room around whether or not to use on or of.
Yeah, it was that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
That was definitely that kind of discussion. But it was, James has said this Program for Research on or of Black Americans, but that was, he didn't tell you that. That was really kind of nuanced.
Okay.
The big thing was that rubric, as a way to have a meta rubric for all of the growing numbers. And by that time, the other thing that had occurred was how to sustain the whole thing relatively long term, because you had, at that time, you had National Survey of Black Americans, you had the NIMH training grant, Survey Research in Black Mental Health training grant, and then you also had the 3-generation family study. And then, you began the scaffold on it with the youth study, and there were several proposals, because James has certainly negotiated lots of, again, foundation, kind of a one-shot kind of foundation funding just to keep the thing afloat. But then there was a big proposal that we were working on, for a long time. It ultimately got some money from a Ford Foundation proposal. That ultimately got some kind of funding, but that went through several iterations. There were also some discussions, big grants, with Ned Gramlich, who was who ultimately, at that time, was director of IPS, the Institute for Public Policy Studies, and who became the founding dean of the Gerald Ford School for Public Policy. In fact, I think they're having a big event in his honor, coming up soon. There were a bunch of collaborating. In fact, we had one Ford proposal that was joint with them. It was kind of joint, looking at poverty in the black population as another way to get some kind, because that was something that foundations found attractive with some Ford foundations. But so we had a whole bunch of things like that going on just to try to sustain funding, because that, once you become a program, still the challenge for PRBA, and also for every other program at the Institute for Social Research. How do you sustain it long term? So there was a bunch of discussions, and PRBA became the rubric, to frame the sequelae of projects, to keep the thing moving, but also the additional proposals to try to sustain a viable program of research and training. In some ways, that first NIMH study, that first NIMH training grant, it was kind of solidified a solid training component, which all of those things have continued to until today.
Right. So my understanding is that there's a three-legged stool at the PRBA that includes research, training, and translation. And so part of what you're saying is that the strong sort of institutionalized training component of it comes at the time when the training grant, the postdoc training program is installed.
As a way to try to fund the data collection.
Right, as a way to, yes.
I remember, because in some ways that's one strategic way to do it. Although there was always an aspiration to do training, we wouldn't have done it that early.
Right.
Get some data in first. Some way, but we, it was finessed, and with some integrity, and there's good documentation of some of that, that is to show NIH that we had something to train with. And there was always the translational thing. The translational thing was implicit even in the concept of the proposal. You're not just collecting data.
Okay.
For scientific reasons.
Right.
Only.
Right.
But the notion not so much translation as it is policy relevance. Slightly different framing. That is, this study is not only a viable national resource for social science research, not only in psychology, sociology, political science. We had economists. Had economists involved in the instrument development. Therefore multidisciplinary social science, but also policy to inform policy in public health, in social welfare, family stuff, in education. So there was always the not so much translation in the sense that you might think about it in current parlance, but basic social science and also policy relevant information to inform decision making. And there was also a big emphasis in the early days of providing baseline data for more to provide some foundation for more local community area studies. Norms, because at the time NIMH had funded and was interested. It was a period where community mental health was a growing kind of phenomenon, and there were studies of catchment areas, Chicago, or South Side. People were doing studies of black mental health issues within those defined geographic community-based locations. So part of the benefit of having a national study also is you provide baseline data within which to understand, what was unique about those particular community areas, if you will, or those local community studies. That was part of this policy framing, to inform decision making and inform practice and policy, to not only understand those factors that impede or promote the mental health of the African American population, but also to inform policy and practice set up to improve mental health among the African American population, and employment policy with the kind of economist Ron Brown, who was one of the graduate students very much involved in the instrument development, and data collection, interested in kind of political participation, and political activism on the part of the African American population. So very, very multidisciplinary in terms of the scientific, basic research focus, but always a very clear focus on policy relevance.
Got it. Okay, so given the so we have discussed with others, and I think there's some more common knowledge about the role of not the role necessarily, but the nature of the three-generation study, and some discussions around the youth study, which is also sometimes referred to as the panel study. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what was done with the training portion of the activities, especially since they're so deeply connected to trying to get the NSBA out of the field?
But also just part of that was we have to sustain an infrastructure. You have to sustain the staff.
Why don't you explain to people what that? Yeah. So that means.
In order to if you see what usually funds even national data collections, it's not a program staff. It's interviewers to get the data. So in some ways we also needed some infrastructure staff or secretaries. Who's gonna be in the office? Who's gonna answer the phones? So in order to maintain a staff to actually use as a basis to generate new proposals. Mm-hmm. So the training grant was conceptualized as a way to keep people together and to help fund infrastructure necessary for sustaining a staff sufficient for even getting a multi-year study out of the field. Mm-hmm. So that's the one logic model behind why the training thing so early. Mm-hmm. The training thing would have been done, mm-hmm. not that early. Mm-hmm. It would have been done at a more normative time once the data was in. Mm-hmm. And the primary researchers that had a chance to utilize it. Mm-hmm. Then you archive it and make it available in the public domain. Mm-hmm. How about a training grant? Mm-hmm. But we didn't have that luxury. Largely because of the way the training grant was written, and so I worked with James, myself, and Jerry Gurin worked very closely together. I basically took primary responsibility for directing the training program, and with support from both Jerry and James, and pretty much was set up to funding for some infrastructure support, and also to support graduate students or postdocs, and some funds for some people to support the postdocs. So we had funds for 2 full-year postdocs, and then 8 summer postdocs we bring in the summer. Mm-hmm. For 5 years.
And what kinds of things did folks work on as a part of the training?
The promissory note. Right. The promissory note was NSBA data.
Got it. Okay.
Which is why I said it's scaffolded on the NSBA data. Mm-hmm. But we had to get the data. So there was something that's in. I don't know when I was looking at a recent newsletter that was written in 1981 that covered the first 2 years. Mm. So the thing was funded in '79 too. Mm. So you see, it had to be done real early, right in the middle of data collection.
Yeah.
So it went from '79 to '84. I'm pretty sure that was the dates on it.
Okay. So the NSBA and all of its associated studies and the training component are kind of, there's a period of high activity between the late 70s and maybe up to about the mid 80s. What are some notable celebratory moments along that period that you recall being particularly excited about, that you might have thought to yourself and really realized to yourself exactly the import of what was going on? Because sometimes when you're in the trenches doing it, you don't realize it. Were there moments in time that you really realize what it is that you guys were doing? Did that come about later? If you could just talk about some of the standout, celebratory, important moments over that period of time.
Yeah, from my own perspective, other people have to speak for themselves, but I got a pretty good sense that all of us knew what we were doing, and we wouldn't have, it's extraordinary amount of sacrifice. So we wouldn't have done it unless we thought it would have had some rather historic significance. And I think that's true for myself, for James, for Belinda, and Jerry supported us, I think with the same idea, that this was not just otherwise we wouldn't have it's a lot of work, I can tell you that. So much work that, it's like, could you do it all over again? Probably not. It was that much work. So people weren't naive about it. In fact, that's why they did it. Now the question was, could we pull it off with all the obstacles and lack of funding and the kind of discontinuities with staff? It was not easy. So there was if anything, there were those challenging periods along the way when can we really get through this next challenge? Can we get some more money before the money runs out? Can we keep this thing moving? There were those, but not any question about the significance of what we were doing. It was really more about can we overcome these obstacles that's in our pathway as we try to, make this happen, and during those periods where, there were, James was always James was a very inspiring guy. So in some ways James deserves a lot of credit, if as a leader, if you will, because I think that's probably one very important aspect of leadership. In those periods of time, can you keep people motivated? Can you, and it's a little easy to keep young, crazy people motivated. But the credit still goes, I think, to James, and then also having the responsibility while we were, knee deep in trying to get the work done, him trying to get money, because he was responsible, primarily for, that, kind of trajectory, as the PI on the study, and we worked with him, but in some ways he was out hustling money all the time, and had to also deal with ISR leadership, and Jerry, support him and other senior staff at ISR. So we got a lot of senior staff support. Certainly Jerry was the program director, but James had to broker most of that, both internally and externally. So James was gone all the time, begging money, foundations, going to NIMH, and it took a much longer time to get this high quality data out the field. So he's got to continue to, promote, if you will. So that was not easy. Not easy for him, but not easy for the rest of us either. So if anything, I can't overstate the challenges and difficulty of getting this thing done. And the toll it took on us, to get it done. In some ways, the graduate students who were in early stages, less so, because in some ways they use the data earlier. But some of us, who were kind of in, spending that much time on data collection when you should be publishing, sacrifice. And in some ways we had to kind of bear that, over multiple years. So if it was anything, that I recall about the uniqueness of that experience was not so much us being naive about, the significance of it, but more just being able to persist and, maintain resiliency, in the face of a whole host of obstacles and challenges all along the way. And I think James and everybody involved, really deserve a lot of credit, for maintaining the course. For my part, what occurred, I also juggled a lot, so at the same time I was a research scientist on the project from the first, because I decided to go do that rather than some other, program of research here at ISR. starting up in '78, because that first year I was Belinda and I, during the time it was being reviewed, the proposal was being reviewed, we were involved in other programs of research at the Server Research Center. But after that, I also had a faculty appointment, joint appointment in the Department of Psychology and in African American Studies. So I had to teach and do my day job.
And so you were doing, not only were you teaching,
I had a joint appointment with teaching in psychology and in African American Studies.
Right. But so during this time, and you're a first, second, third year junior member of the faculty in these departments.
That's when I'm doing all this stuff.
And you also have a faculty research scientist appointment at ISR. You're knee deep in issues related to NSBA.
Well, that's what we were doing.
Right.
So
and you're still got your fairly standard teaching load.
Right.
And you're
in still, 2 units, in psychology and in African American Studies.
And you're still expected, of course, during this time. The expectation
you're on tenure track.
Right, that you're going to be publishing actively.
Right.
Okay, and so you talk about maintaining the resilience. You talk about the role of James, if you will, as sort of a charismatic leader to kind of keep people in the game. I've heard several different conversations about some of the informal activities that were
a lot of fun.
Were a part of the culture, what became the, if you could say, sort of the culture of the PRBA. I've heard things about house parties. I've heard things about basketball teams. So if you could tell us a little bit about some of what you recall about some of these more informal activities, and how you think they work to kind of keep the what really kind of grew to be kind of a family kind of atmosphere at the PRBA.
Yeah, profoundly so. So there's no question that all of us, given the struggle that I emphasized, and I didn't overemphasize it, part of that also creates bonding. I was talking to Mary today, Goodman, about that period and us doing proposals. I never did a proposal without staying up all night and getting it to FedEx the minute before the plane leaves. And that creates bonding. And then I even though by the time the study got funded, Belinda and I were new PhDs. We were just new PhDs. We had been graduate students with the graduate students who were working on the projects. So all of us were, cohort, and very close. And though kind of intense, we traveling to New Orleans, to Atlanta, to LA, to Vegas, to New York, training interviewers, to go into Harlem and the Desire projects in New Orleans, the Robert Taylor home, Cabrini Green in Chicago, go out to Vegas and find some black people, go into Watts and Compton, that creates bonds, because y'all got to make that happen. Mm-hmm. So there's no question, we had really, really intense extended family, kind of bonds between us, that we have to this day. And you're right, we had parties, probably, it's from the start, from the start, I had to give Belinda Tucker credit for some of the best early parties before she left and went to UCLA, because Belinda had lots of West Indian friends. Mm. So we had some, we used to have these for the first, I guess Belinda was here for the first couple of years, and we have to have some of these. But in fact, I think Bob Marley was at a couple of the parties. No, he wasn't really, but he may as well been. We had some really nice parties, and then after Belinda left, we all had, we all hosted parties and stuff, and it had some very good times, and people were very close. I mean, much beyond normal collegial relationships. We certainly had relationships at the extended family level. My kids, I had kids, so all my kids grew up, as part of the, PRBA. In fact, PRBA people help raise them. It's a village, if you will. So there's no question. But part of it was not only, the bonding that occurred with the, challenge of the work, if you will, but also you're absolutely right. Those expressive, festive, kind of occasions where we had a chance to kind of, have fun together too.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to hear your take a little bit on the basketball team. Various people have characterized the basketball games in various ways. So just take a second to tell us about the basketball team, who was on it, the different players, maybe some of the strengths and weaknesses of the different players.
Well, when I first came to here as a graduate student, I wasn't a bad basketball player. I was pretty good. When I first came here as a graduate student, from my perspective, I wouldn't have had no trouble people in the NBA out there, because I had that kind of, repertoire, at least, in terms of my own, basketball self-efficacy. At the time. Now, that was early. By the time PRBA started, I still had those concepts, but physically, I certainly couldn't deliver like I could, say, 7 years earlier. But I still, I had a little juice, left, and I probably was the only one of the staff who had played, basketball, collegiate basketball. So, it was not too bad. Even though, by the third or fourth quarter, it wasn't like the first quarter. And everybody enjoyed basketball. It's kind of interesting. Everybody had their own personalities, but everybody enjoyed basketball. So that's why we had such a good time. It was one of those teams we were on, my brother-in-law, who he and I played together in college. And he was a little younger than me. So he really still had a little bit more juice left. He's in fact, he's, so as a senior, he was off. So it's probably, so he had just kind of moved here and was getting a master's degree here and was kind of working here. And so he got on our team, and he was by far the best shape, and it was good, So we had played together in college, and he was really good, Walt Mannon. So most of you'll probably hear, and he still had juice in the fourth quarter. I had juice in the first quarter, second quarter, by the third quarter I was about through. But we had a lot of fun, and everybody else had, all of them enjoyed basketball. Everybody enjoyed basketball, and everybody could play. Everybody had their own, basketball repertoire. I think one of the things that often is said in the African American community, about basketball is as a ritual, that people's personalities are kind of reflected in their games, and our NSBA team was no exception. Every single individual, including me, and I'm sure people would say the same thing about me, and they're probably right, So that's what was also funny and fun about it. Everybody got out there and did their thing, and they played just about exactly like they operated. So we had a lot of fun. I wish we could have videotaped some of those games. It would have been, it's been hilarious. Because they even hilarious even remembering those games with every personality, out there doing their thing and having fun. So we had some good times.
Did people have nicknames?
We would tease each other. I think everyone teased each other. Because that's the informal thing about basketball. And James, everybody always called James Action Jackson, because James is always, he's still like that, even though all of us has toned down some at this stage of the game, but James had a very active game. Let me put it that way, so his basketball game was not that different from the way he operated. And at that time, all of us were young, so James used to get around. James used to get around real quick, and be all over the court. Like he tends to be all over everything, and I'm sure people would probably say the same thing about me in a different way, So we, but I remember people definitely refer to James as Action Jackson, sometimes, and appropriately so. But all of us, I think, had our own, niche, on the team, and I can't remember any other salient nicknames that come to mind.
So, as you recall, what was the kind of team philosophy on passing?
I think we had no really. I don't think we had any kind of people who were trying to be superstars or anything like that. I think people were out there, I don't remember anybody who just shot all the time, except maybe Walt shot quite a bit because he should have, because he was the best player on the team.
So then it would come as a surprise to you if other people characterized you as being a person who, once you got the ball, you shot the ball.
Well, probably because I can shoot better than other people. And the only person who could shoot better than me is Walt. And okay. He probably shot more than me.
Okay.
Probably appropriately so. I've had no trouble with it.
Okay. So there were a range of informal activities. Did you guys sometimes come up with ideas for the work that in the course of doing the informal stuff? Or was
what you mean, the
survey stuff, the question stuff, the method stuff, in the process of kind of, maybe after a game, say, hey, or was it?
I mean, the basketball games were just, we just had fun. We had a lot of informal relationships together. Other than that, so we would definitely talk a lot about the kind of intellectual stuff, some of the problem solving and decision making in informal context. But I don't remember the basketball thing was very isolated. We probably played basketball much less than we partied. Mm-hmm. So we probably doing more informal stuff around parties more than we did basketball. Basketball just was kind of funny. Mm-hmm. There were even some plays. I think we even played football or something a couple of times, flag football sometimes. We'd have picnics periodically too. So I think, I don't think there was anything unique about the basketball as a context for informal, kind of exchange. But there was a bunch of informal exchange. To be frank, perhaps the most informal exchanges that occurred, in fact, around the intellectual work for NSBA, transitioning to PRBA, was because of the fact that we only had myself and James and Belinda as PhDs. We had to have discussions about everybody's dissertations, and all of whom used the data. And or presentations at conferences, or papers, or products, that the graduate students were being mentored on because they needed to get done. You have to have conversations, because how else does Wayne get his dissertation done, or Robert get his dissertation done, or Cleo gets her dissertation done, or Linda Chatters get her dissertation done without those kind of conversations. Mm-hmm. So if there were any kind of formal and informal context for intellectual, kind of conversations. Or for that matter, they better get this data in real quick because I gotta get out of here. And there was a bunch of that, because much of if you look at the human resource thing, they were graduate students, right? So they had to get done, and with the exception of myself, Belinda. Even Shirley finished up while we were doing it. and Letha went back to school. So she wasn't even a doctoral student initially. She went back to school. So there was a bunch of intellectual discussions, and also discussions about when we get this data, because I got to get my proposal in, or defend my proposal, or I got to ultimately get out of here. Which in some ways really helped structure us getting things done. Because accountabilities. Because people really. Could not just be engaged in service activity into perpetuity. They also needed to get their dissertation work done.
Okay, so so before we kind of transition to what I imagine will be a fairly brief discussion about the NSAL, because during that time you weren't necessarily here, although I imagine you were connected in conversations.
Yeah, I did. I was always did consulting with, and by that time you had the graduate students moving leadership roles. So by the time I left here in '84, 84 to 86, you had graduate students now who had finished and they moved into faculty roles. So in some ways they became the kind of leadership James continued to steward. But you had Woody and Cleo and Robert and Linda can kind of step in and step into program leadership roles. Linda and Rob left for a couple of years and went out to Boston, but they came back. So all of that work was really done with those who had been graduate students, stepping into primary research roles and then kind of taking the PRBA to the next level with funding, but all in the same tradition of scaffolding on what?
The NSBA.
Right.
Right.
And it's certainly part of the political context afterwards was a need to kind of focus more, for lack of a better term, narrowly or specifically on the set of mental health issues. Largely because that had currency with NIMH. So the work that Woody certainly played a central role in that for a period of time. And then got ancillary work done in aging. With Robert and Linda playing a significant role in that, because that's where NIA and NIMH ended up being the primary sources of funding to sustain the kind of funding stream, and to ultimately transition into the set of data sets that are ongoing. But it was that cadre of former graduate students, new PhD, junior faculty progressing through the professorial ranks, to this day, which is kind of interesting. To me, I think it's one of the more impressive things about PRBA. Is that you really had people grow up in PRBA, who were graduate students, and now they full professors, and pretty much, over the decades have kind of maintained the core of leadership.
So now it's 2014. There are a lot of things going on, including people not only analyzing still. So I just reviewed a paper, by the way, for a journal where they're presenting data on the NSBA. So not only still analyzing NSBA data, but analyzing NSAL data and the NSAL 3-generational data increasingly. And so there are all these things going on. There's also a shifting funding environment. And so if you could just say a little bit about how you see the PRBA today, thinking about if there are kind of research units nationally that might be similar or not, and to what extent, to what niche do you see really the PRBA fitting, in today's not only research environment, but funding environment, training environment, and if you could say a little bit about the current role you see it playing in terms of training, what you might sort of speculate is maybe the third or fourth generation of social scientists.
Yeah, in some ways, I think you referred to a three-legged stool, kind of early. That there's at least kind of three prongs to that, among others. One is that, PRBA, based at ISR, in the survey methodological and social science tradition that ISR, has carved out historically, then PRBA becomes a unique place. There can't be any place like PRBA because there can't be no place like ISR. And that becomes increasingly true as you scaffold, from the NSBA to all the way up to through the set of cross-national studies that's currently being done. Who else can do that? Except a program born within ISR. So that speaks for itself. We understood that at the beginning, which I told you there was always a clarity on that. Baseline data. Baseline data on which to do, trend studies into perpetuity. Baseline data to do panels. Baseline data to do 3-generation studies. That's ISR. That's in the DNA here. So the PRBA just represents the foundation for doing such work with African Americans at the center. But by definition, with the diversification that's occurring and the globalization that's occurring, that's bound to move into different directions. But the foundation is unique. And not only do we do that first national cross-section study of the black population with a probability sample representative of the entire black population, so that nothing can be like that. I think secondly, the tradition of quantitative research on survey data here, and with ICPSR doing the archiving as they do, as a repository of data, for all members. PRBA, data is also cast within that not only survey methods tradition, but also quantitative analysis of that survey data to inform social science knowledge development. Psychology, sociology, political science, economics, it would not ever be anything like PRBA data, because there's nothing like ISR data. There's nothing like ICPSR. That I think, as long as and the question really is, will that continue to morph like it has over the last 3 decades, or will there be some major shift into some other form, some isomorphism, into some, who knows. But there's no question that the foundation laid by PRBA will be part and parcel to whatever that transformation is. Whether or not it's in the same, tenor that has occurred over the last 30 years, or whether it transforms into something else. That's the social science part. The training part, by extension. The degree to which you'll have some training stuff that builds on PRBA stuff in the context of training programs like ICPSR summer training program, that'll continue. How can it not? People come in, even if he doesn't have Mosi Ifatunji teaching methodological issues in quantitative research on race and ethnicity. People come in and get access to the data sets, right? And PRBA would still be reflected in those, but I suspect that, you'll get more niche, type training like methodological issues in quantitative research on race and ethnicity and others, that would end up even making that even more so as a training. Likewise, you got all these people who've been trained here, they're all over the country, training new generations in the tradition of work at PRBA, using using the data set, or certainly using what they've learned here in other contexts, So in some ways, that also reflects a kind of isomorphism, if you will, of PRBA cross-institutionally. I'm sure the work that David Williams is doing at Harvard reflects PRBA. I'm sure the work that, even though, work that Larry was doing here, was utilized kind of a allied set of data, still reflects the same tradition. You get people at major universities all over the country, So, yeah, PRBA will be reflected in all of that work. The question is, in what form? That's just, history will dictate that. So I think even in training, both within the context of the University of Michigan, in the ICPSR, or the summer program and survey methods, or in training in the social sciences and professional schools here that operate in the Michigan tradition with these joint programs. For example, in the professional schools and policy, whether it be social work and social science, whether it be the combined program in education and psychology, whether it be the joint program in social science and public policy, whether it be public health, they all reflect, training with PRBA trained people, very critical to the leadership, of those training programs. Likewise, in the basic social behavior sciences, in psychology, in sociology, in political science, in economics. So that's training. So that I think is historically deeply rooted. I think the question really becomes what will happen in terms of the transformation of PRBA as a program of research in the Research Center for Group Dynamics, and how will it adapt like other programs at ISR, like other programs at the Research Center for Group Dynamics, to the changing funding environment, to the changing, kind of a role that ISR, the Survey Research Center for Group Dynamics, play in the academic work, of the schools and colleges. That's all evolving organizational stuff, and I'm sure it will adapt, and what that adaptation is, I'm sure to be intelligent, but I wouldn't, that's up to, those young people, who are getting ready to move into this cohort replacement kind of process. I look forward to participating with James and whomever else may be interested in contributing whatever I can to make good decisions about how to make PRBA more adaptive. But everything's transforming.
Trying to think if there are any other scripted issues. If you want to, if there's anything that you...
There's a third, the
translation.
Well, it's not translation really in the tradition of ISR. In the tradition of ISR, it's really more policy relevance. Slightly different framing of your translation. So translation of metaphor, bench to bedside, health sciences. In the ISR tradition, if you think about the way ISR started, it wasn't translation. ISR started with with people coming here with funding from the Army research.
Oh, ISR, yes. Mm-hmm.
Is that translation though, or is that just policy relevant work? Do you see the point of it? Mm-hmm. So ISR has deep roots in doing research with social relevance, to inform decision making. You could use a translational rubric for that, but in some ways it's a misnomer, for all the work. Some work, especially in the health sciences, will be translational, but some of the work is not so much translational as it is policy relevant or applied. Those are all different metaphors for talking about impact. If one looks at the tradition of ISR here, the kind of practice relevant, the way in which ISR operates in the training of professional schools here, social work, public policy, public health. That's not translational. It informs practice and policy in those particular professional schools. There's a translational element there, but I wouldn't want to reduce all of it to translation, because that would be, one would miss kind of the role that ISR has played, both internal to the professional schools, the practice communities, the policy communities here on campus, and the way the graduates, of ISR and PRBA, are doing that at professional schools all over the nation. Practice and policy, and the degree to which the information, that comes out of PRBA inform decisions in professional practice and in policy. I've done work, kind of at the discovered this, when I got a PhD in social psychology, basic research. But I spent much of my career, at Northwestern and several other places, working at the boundary of social science and public policy. And this work, will maintain that kind of social meaning. Not only PRBA but ISR as a whole. It transforms. And some of the work I think that James has kind of led as director of ISR in this era of globalization. Makes the cross-national work, have another layer of that. It's not so much translational as it is policy relevant, and practice relevant, and useful for informing and guiding decision making, and I think that, to me, is going to only grow. And in some ways, I think the management of that is going to be critical for the future, of how that's framed and how that's funded. In some ways, for example, the panel study for income dynamics, a lot of projects, the funding here is because they are studies that ask questions that provide the most useful information for people developing policy. That's why, the government continues to underwrite them. That's why foundations, contribute. To me, as you get shrinkages in availability of funding in NSF and NIH, for the type of traditional work that ISR has traditionally done, it really makes that framing even that much more critical, and a balance, between research that simply advances knowledge in basic social behavioral science fields, psychology, sociology, political science, economics. It also makes it absolutely critical to begin to articulate and promote and get funded for work that is also important for policymaking, and it includes the corporate world. And to me, that's going to be an evolving challenge for leadership, at ISR as a whole, and PRBA, becomes, I think, a critical part of that. But it's not the only one. I think every program of research here at ISR, in some ways, is facing that same challenge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as we sort of begin to wrap up here, if there's anything, that you want to have as part of the record, that in relationship to PRBA and ISR, and in particular just your own experiences, if there's anything that you kind of want to share with folks that we haven't already covered.
No, nothing, in particular. I think it's at this stage of my life, and I'm sure those in my cohort, including James and Letha, and even those graduate students, who came along, who are also in our cohort, because we were all really the same age, really, when one looks at it cohort-wise. I think, it's just interesting to look back, That's been how many years?
35.
Yeah, 35 years it's been. Since '79, right? About 35 years. Yeah, to kind of look back over 35 years, because in some ways, that first '78 was really the first year the thing was funded. But at any rate, it's really very heartening to kind of look back and see the proliferation of resources and expertise that's been produced and kind of promoted, kind of spurred by kind of PRBA as a catalyst, as a kind of catalytic, kind of agent, and the degree to which, that spread across the institutions with students and products of PRBA, and that, that's at my age, is kind of a good thing to kind of see, and you really, I just hope that, that there's some continuity, because the final comment is that I think there's a kind of critical period that we're in now, with the need for a kind of core group of young scholars to articulate a strategic agenda that not only has currency within ISR, but has currency within the kind of evolving business model, that has to be worked out here, and also, just in terms of its meaningfulness to the outside world, and that's why I emphasize the kind of policy relevant thing. I think that's going to have to really be a critical part of it, because I think the social science stuff is robust, but that won't necessarily pay the bills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.